Thank you for attending our session today, The Wrens and the Wireless War with Peter Hoare. My name is Liz Pidgeon and I'm the Local and Family History Librarian for Yarra Plenty Regional Library. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. I pay my respects to elders past and present and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be present today. We are partnering in partnership with Yarra Plenty Regional Library in Melbourne's North, Public Libraries Victoria, Eastern Regional Libraries, Melton City Libraries and AFO's National Family History Month for this presentation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today. The following is a brief introduction to his amazing career, and to learn more, please check Peter's official website and page on Wikipedia. Captain Peter Hoare, RN retired, served worldwide as a logistician during a 38-year career in the Royal Navy, including service in the United States Navy. He is qualified as an interpreter in Spanish and Swedish and as a Cantonese linguist. Peter writes reviews and articles for several newspapers and journals. As a freelance obituarist at the London Daily Telegraph since 2002, he has written some 1,500 obituaries on men and women of the Royal Navy, the Royal Marines and the Merchant Navy, the French Resistance, yachtsmen, shipping magnates and more. He has written or edited a dozen other books on naval history, biography and strategy, which can be found at Amazon's Peter Hoare page. He is an elected fellow of the Royal Historical Society, of the Society for Nautical Research and of the Royal Swedish Society for Nautical Sciences, as well as a chartered member of the Institute of Linguistics. Peter first visited Australia as a sub-lieutenant in HMS Oresiasa, I hope I've expressed that one properly, in 1967, and last visited us in 2008 as part of his research for his book for HMAS Sydney Cipher and Search, Solving the Last Great Naval Mystery of the Second World War. In the year 2000, he started a 9-year career in the film and TV industry and is now a full-time editor, writer and journalist. His latest book is Bletchley Park, Secret Source, Churchill's Wrens and the WWII Service in World War II, where Peter has revealed this largely unknown story, which is also illustrated with individual stories throughout the text. Early in 2020, Peter had occasion to write an email query to Yarra Plenty Regional Library, and the query was sent to me, and I was really happy to help him find some information. And earlier this year, he advised that he had published his book, and would I like a Zoom talk? So without further ado, I will say good morning, Peter, welcome.
Good morning, thank you. Can you hear me?
All good, thank you.
Excellent. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to give you a short presentation on PowerPoint, if I may, about a group of Wrens, an elite group of Wrens, only about 400 women, who were specially recruited in the war, and whose secret, they can't even claim to be forgotten here at heroines, because actually their history has never been written, and they were so exclusive, so secretive about their work, that very few records were kept post-war. There were about 400 of them. I am going to mention a few of them, and they have to stand as representatives of all the others. Let's see what happens next. And before I go on, I want to thank some of those friends in Australia who've helped me in my research. Richard, Susan, Rebecca, Deirdre McPherson, Robert Marshall, who I know is here today, John Perryman, and of course you, Liz. Thank you very much indeed. If I say Scarborough to you, I don't mean Scarborough in Western Australia. I mean Scarborough in Yorkshire. And I have to, while I'm going to talk about some people, I have to talk and explain to you some of the technicalities involved here. And the bombardment of Scarborough was an event in 1914, which scarred the mind, the psyche of the British nation, and was used for recruiting purposes afterwards. because it was regarded as an outrage. The German Navy shelled an undefended town on the North Sea coast. But actually, men of Britain will stand for this. Actually, there may have been a reason why Scarborough was a target, because wireless warfare had started very early. It had started before the First World War, when the Royal Navy established a telegraphy station in Scarborough. It's now the oldest continuously used signal intelligence center in the world. And this is a plan from 1910, and it shows exactly how much use, even then, the Admiralty intended to use wireless. You see all these black dots are wireless stations. The rather simple word "big wireless," that is Jackie Fisher's words. And notice too, he was going to have 4 gunboats fitted with wireless stationed off the German coast. Wireless warfare was very quickly used in the First World War. It was used in the preliminaries to the battle between Sydney and the Emden. And it was also used in 1916 before the Battle of Jutland, when the Germans very cleverly left their wireless call sign behind in Williamshaven, so that the Admiralty had reduced notice of the sailing of the German fleet. Why is it called wireless? Well, it was called wireless intercept. It was written WI and it was pronounced Y. That's quite simply the reason. And the Y services developed independently. In Britain, the Foreign Office, the police, the War Office, the Air Ministry when it came about post-war, and the Admiralty all had their separate Y services. That was clearly illogical, and gradually those services became one. This is how it looked in the interwar years. There were 2 principal Admiralty wireless stations, one near Winchester, one in Scarborough, and they were intended for direction finding using high frequency on German ships in the North Sea. In the immediate years before the Second World War, a DF section was added in the Admiralty, and a coordinating center was added. It was known as Station X, but today we know that Station X is actually Bletchley Park. It was also a worldwide service. The Admiralty had stations in Gibraltar, Malta, and Hong Kong. And as the war began, it was intended to extend that service with stations at Murmansk, Bombay, Singapore, and Australia. You remember this bit, of course. Men of Britain, will you stand for this? Well, with the rapid extension of the Y service, there weren't enough men to go round. And guess who stood up? Of course, it was the women. And I have to introduce you to this formidable character, Vera Laughton. She was a Wren in the First World War. Very briefly, she was rapidly promoted. You see there, she's got 2.5 stripes. And Vera Laughton was a remarkable lady, impeccable credentials. She was the daughter of the historian Sir John Knox Laughton. She had one of the early graduates of female graduates of King's College London. She served in the Wrens for a year. She became a journalist, and she was a suffragette. She wrote for the Suffragette magazine. She wrote for Ladies' Field, and she wrote for Time and Tide. Well, the Wrens were disbanded at the end of the First World War, but again, at the start of the Second World War, there was an urgent need for women. And who should we send for? We have to send for Vera. She's now Vera Laughton Mathews, and she is promoted to a Rear Admiral equivalent, and she's given the task of re-establishing the Wrens. Initially, the men wanted to give the Wrens domestic jobs as writers, as drivers, as coders, messengers, domestics, cooks, and stewards. But Vera was very, very intent that her girls should have operational roles. So when the requirement arose for Wrens to man the WWII service, women who knew Morse, women who knew German and Italian and even Japanese, Vera seized the opportunity. She had, in the meantime, in the war, she had kept the Association of Wrens going. She had set up and managed the Sea Rangers. She became skipper, and that's why in the Sea Rangers in Britain, many of the leaders are called skipper. But they're not because they're skippers of the units, but because Vera Laughton Mathews' nickname was skipper. And in 1939, she was summoned to re-establish the Wrens. And she became the director of the Wrens, or known to everybody else as VLM. So, looking at the East, looking at your part of the world, the intention was to move the station from Hong Kong, which is under threat from Japanese expansion, to Singapore, and to create a new station in Alexandria. And the person chosen to lead a group of Wrens to the Far East, the first group of Wrens ever to be sent overseas in wartime, it wasn't permitted in the First World War, and this was the first time in the Second World War. The person chosen was Betty Archdale. Betty was the daughter of a suffragette, Helen Archdale. She was the goddaughter of Emily Pankhurst, the leader of the suffragettes, and she'd been called to the bar in 1938. And she later became, after the war, the principal of Sydney University's Women's College and a member of the University Senate for 25 years. However, you might better remember her as the headmistress of Abbottsley, or even more so because she was a test cricketer and she beat the Australians. She played in 5 test matches for England. She was the captain of England on their first tour of the women's team of Australia and New Zealand in 34-35. And she was the first female life member of the MCC. So she was a very determined and very successful lady. Betty, this is her on the right. She was chosen to lead this first group of Wrens to Singapore. This remarkable picture is taken in January 1940 because it was such an excitement. It was so unusual that the Wrens, any women should be sent overseas at this stage, is that they were summoned to the Admiralty to meet the First Sea Lord and the Lord High Poobah, and they were asked to dress in their tropical uniforms. Well, it doesn't take much to realize the girls hated these uniforms, and I'll show you another picture of how they changed the uniforms for themselves. This is the remarkable, here on the left is Princess Marina. She had already begun changing the uniform because she'd reblocked her hat. And you can see it, instead of that huge wide brim thing that Vera was wearing, it looks slightly smaller and slightly neater. And what happened was the girls were sent out. They couldn't go through the Mediterranean, that was closed because of the wartime operations. They were sent out to South Africa with the intention of being sent on to Singapore and to Alexandria. But what happened was that the commander-in-chief objected. He said he did not think that women could stand up to the rigors of a war zone. I don't know what you might think about that remark today, but it caused a ruckus in London, and it caused a problem in South Africa. Half of the party of women were sent back to England, thus risking transport in the Atlantic again, and the other half were sent to Singapore. That's how they got there. The girls were keen enough to start learning Japanese Morse. Japanese Morse is slightly different because you have to encrypt or to write in Morse the Japanese kana. So there are more syllables in Japanese Morse, but the girls very rapidly seized this opportunity, and on their way out to Singapore at sea, they set themselves the task of learning this new code. There's one of the girls at work in Singapore. This looks rather curated to me, because the descriptions they give, and I've got some of them in my book, it was very hot and it was very sweaty, and they worked with towels around their necks and drinks of cold liquid on the table. They became part of the Far East Combined Bureau, the FECB, which had moved from Hong Kong to Singapore to be out of range of the Japanese. This is a group of the women when they had established themselves in Singapore. It's a wedding photograph. I can't actually, and I haven't yet been able to identify who all of these people are, but that's Betty, of course, in the middle. This is the bride, I think, and I don't know. I do know this is Margaret Rogers, and I've got another picture of her later on, but I'm afraid I don't yet know who these women are. But look how they modified their uniforms. They've got rid of those ghastly white stockings, and they're wearing ankle socks. They've got little rushed sleeves on the uniforms now, and they're wearing skirts and blouses instead of those dreadful canvas dresses. As the Japanese advanced, thought was given to moving the FECB to Australia, but no decision was made. I know that very oddly, because there are only five veterans, 5 survivors of this group of women, but I know that one of them kept this signal. Signals, if you're an archivist, a historian, a researcher, signals are usually ephemera, and not very many exist. But one of the girls kept this signal, and that's how I know that in December 1941, the Admiralty was thinking of moving the FECB to Australia. But they didn't go to Australia, they went to Colombo instead. They set up in a place called HMS Anderson on the golf course outside Colombo. And it was just as well they did, because at Easter 1942, the Japanese intended to raid Colombo. The Eastern Fleet was in harbour, but the Wrens of the WWII service gave a warning. They gave adequate warning. The fleet was sailed, and a second Pearl Harbor was forestalled by these Wrens, their first entry into operational service. This had another effect. This is Vera in her full majesty, and she worked out an Admiralty policy. She, bearing in mind that Admiral Cunningham didn't want Wrens in Alexandria, she set about to establish a proper policy for the deployment of women overseas. The policy was that they should not be sent to places where there risk of them being captured. But if things, and this is a quote from an official document, in the event of things going wrong, women should remain at their posts and be expected to behave like men. And this rule was the rule which subsequently was adapted by all the other armed services. You see that lady on the right, on the left here? She was sent to Jessie Frith. She was sent to interview Admiral Cunningham. She was sent with some colleagues, two junior officers, to interview Admiral Cunningham and to persuade him to change his mind. And of course he did, because a few months later he wrote that the first Wrens had arrived on his staff. They'd arrived from Algiers in the destroyers Pen and Pathfinder. The Wrens specials is a joke, because that's WS, and at the same time as the Wrens specials had arrived in Africa, in North Africa, the Winston specials, WS, were being shipped around South Africa. And this is what Cunningham was obliged to say: these were most useful ladies, forerunners of many more who were presently to join us, and their services were invaluable. So that is what's happening in the Indian Ocean and in the Far East. But we have to just turn the clock back to 1940 and see what is happening at home. And we discovered in 1940 that the Germans were using VHF, very high frequency, for tactical communications at shorter range, 20 to 25 miles. And they were using them in E-boats, but not in U-boats, as we discovered from trials. The difference is this: high frequency is long range, used for direction finding, used for locating enemy ships. It's used for radio fingerprinting, which means that with a little bit of technology and using a cathode ray tube, you could identify an individual transmitter. And there was a special Z section for that. And TINA doesn't stand for anything. It's a name that just came into use. These girls, the Wren operators, and bearing in mind they were all late teens, early 20s, they became so skilled that they could recognize individual operators. And they fed their results back to Bletchley Park. Very high frequency was mostly voice communication. It could also be used for direction finding. It could be used for early warning, so that the Germans had a bad habit of warming up their radio sets before they sailed. So the girls could pick these up and they could hear the carrier waves, and they learned simple codes, and they fed their information both to local operation rooms and of course back to Bletchley Park. Now, I want to introduce these two key figures, both proud Australians. On the right is Elizabeth Agar, and I'll come back to her. But on the left is Freddie Marshall, L.A. Marshall, who started the war as a signalman, played a major part in what was known in the Royal Navy as the Altamar incident. And he helped to create the Navy's WWII service. He played an indispensable part in that organization. He's left us, fortunately, this memoir, which is a copy of which is in the Imperial War Museum, of how it worked. This is part 2 of his memoir. There are 2 other parts to it, which I was lucky to find. The third part is his history of the Wrens, which only exists, as far as I know, as some circulating private copies. And I want to introduce this person. What on earth is she doing here? Violetta Thurston. She was a nurse in the First World War, but she was more than just a nurse. She was a powerhouse. She wrote this, that's her life. She wrote Field Hospital and Flying Column as a journal of English nursing sister in Belgium and Russia. She was decorated by all the Allies, including the Russians. She wrote a textbook for war nursing. She was awarded the military medal quite uniquely in the First World War. And in 1939, she lied about her age. You hear stories about people telling you that they're 18 rather than 16. She was 50, and she was too old for the Wrens in 1939, so she knocked a few years off. Good for her. And she had a remarkable career, and she's just one of the fascinating people who I managed to incorporate into the pages of my book. Now, what happened in Britain was there was an urgent need to set up a chain of VHF listening stations around the coast. There's a map of them. This is South Foreland, the first of the stations, which was very rapidly moved to Abbots Cliff. Abbots Cliff is there now. It's a hotel. It was just changed hands. This is a station at Felixstowe. This is a station at Lyme Regis, which is unique in itself, because this is the only photograph I've found, other than one other, which shows the radio aerials. And this is Elizabeth Agar. Elizabeth Agar was a remarkable lady who, born in Glasgow in 1914, her father became a professor of zoology in Melbourne in 1920, so the whole family emigrated. But she came on a European tour in 1934-36. These days, when Australians come to Europe, they travel alone. but in those days she had to travel with her mother and her aunt as chaperones. But she rapidly broke free of them, and she went to Oxford in 1939, 1940, and she also studied in Germany, in Munich, and there's even in her biography, which I'm grateful to Robert for providing me with a copy, she even had tea with Hitler. She trained at Greenwich as a Wren. She very rapidly was sent off to Portland as a Wren. She became also the commander of 2 stations, North Foreland and Torquay. Very briefly, she set up a new station in Torquay and at Sheringham. And I'll just show you those 2 stations. That is what the station at Portland looked like when Elizabeth Agar was there in 1940-41. It was the former Coast Guard's residence. That van outside is actually the direction finding van. That H aerial there is the direction finder. The van was also their escape vehicle in the event of a German landing. The girls were going to pile into this van and drive north away from the Huns. This is North Foreland, where Elizabeth commanded the Wrens for the best part of 2 years. That's another view, a sketch of it. And this is a picture from Elizabeth's photo album. You can see it's the same building, and you can just about see the aerials at the top up here. She no doubt ran a very smart ship. I take it that's Sunday lunch, or perhaps it's everyday lunch, using the hotel, the North Foreland, the Fairness was a former hotel, so they're obviously using hotel cutlery. They also had a rope ladder to get down to the beach. So despite the risks of German invasion, they used to sneak down there in the summer months. And this is an extraordinary picture because it is a picture of the new hats. The girls objected to the dreadful hats that they were issued with. They were left over from the First World War. Vera Mathews engaged a fashion designer to remake the hats. And this is recorded as the first arrival and issue of the new hats. I'm very pleased the girls look too. But this wasn't all entertainment. Those were maybe light-hearted pictures, but I want to emphasize that the girls who worked at the coastal stations in England were actually at risk. They were deeply involved in operations against German mine layers and German E-boats. They were at risk of German raids. They were strapped and bombed by German aircraft and shelled. They lived and worked under the flight path of V1 and V2 flying bombs. And although not these Wrens, but others were actually lost at sea on their journeys to and from the overseas Y stations. Elizabeth was the commanding officer at Sheringham, and this is the direction finding tower. Now you've heard, I'm sure, about code breaking at Bletchley, but direction finding was as important throughout the war as anything else in the services which the Y Wrens provided. One girl alone kept watch in this tower at night. She was connected by telephone to the main station, and her job was to, when they picked up an enemy transmission, was to use this aerial to take a bearing of the enemy. And these octagonal buildings with wooden superstructures were built around the coast, and this is the base of one of them, and that's all that survives of one of these bases. It deserves, in Britain, we give historic buildings blue plaques to record their historical role in life. This building, I'm campaigning for it to have a blue plaque placed on it because it's so important in the history of the Wrens, of the war, and of the work that these women did. I just briefly, just because I want to show you that there are other women involved here. This is Alison Gerrish. Alison Gerrish, I was very lucky to find that she had kept her service certificate. She had an extraordinary career because she started as a Wrens steward at Greenwich, where the training took place. And she found out, to her excitement, that there were other women there who were learning Morse. So between her duties as a Wrens steward, she decided that she would also learn Morse. And you can see that she then persuaded the first officer that she didn't want to be a domestic servant for the rest of the war. She wanted to get into the front line too. So she very quickly was promoted from officer's steward to, this is a chief wren wireless telegraphist. And this is a list of the stations where she worked. There it is. I said the girls trained at Greenwich at the beginning of the war. They ate their meals in the splendid painted hall, which I see Richard Francis is there. He'll remember eating his breakfast there. But in 1942, they moved to a house in Wimbledon, a house at Southmead. And here they are in a cold winter's day, on their way to Southmead. And Southmead, I found the house. It was for sale last year for £3.5 million as a deluxe residence. And again, this is another building where I'm campaigning to have a blue plaque put on it, because nobody knows, nobody realizes that this was the Admiralty's secret training establishment for 3 years of the war, where most of the Wrens, most of these 400 elite Wrens, passed through this building to be trained initially and also to do their refresher courses. So what happened to, by the way, this is a cartoon again from Robert Marshall. Thank you very much indeed. A take on a well-done picture. I hope that's not Betty. That's not Elizabeth Agar in the chair, but there we go. What happened was Scarborough is still in being. The station at Scarborough, which I started this presentation, is now the government communications headquarters, alternate headquarters, heavily guarded behind barbed wire. But behind there too is still the World War II bunker where some of the girls worked. Freddie Marshall, I don't have very many pictures of Freddie Marshall, but he did come back to Britain for a reunion, and you can see that his girls kept in touch with him. They call themselves Freddie's Fairies. I wanted to call my book Freddie's Fairies, but the publisher said, no, the words have changed their meaning now. You'll have to choose something else. This is Margaret Rogers. I showed you a picture of her earlier on. She was one of the Wrens who went to Singapore, Colombo, Mombasa, and then came home to train the other women up. And there she appeared at the Wrens centenary in Portsmouth a few years ago. And this is Pat Outram, or Pat Davies as she is now. Pat is the inspiration for this book, actually, because I met Pat some while ago on a totally unrelated occasion, and she is a quite distinguished, quite well-known television producer. In fact, she was the woman who discovered and first produced a University Challenge. I don't know whether you see that program in Australia, but in the war, she was one of the special duties linguists. And she and her sister, that's Pat, that's her sister Jean. She and her sister were in the same line of business during the war. And remarkably, and this is why their history is not known, because they were so bound by their vows of secrecy that they didn't even tell each other until lunchtime, one Sunday lunch when they were doing the veg prep, late in the 1970s, when one of them turned to the other and said, "What did you do during the war?" And they both fessed up to having been involved in the same business, code breaking and listening to the enemy. Quite astonishing. And they thought, when a man called Fred Winterbottom broke the secret of Bletchley Park and of Ultra, they thought he was a traitor. In fact, the title of this book, We Kept the Secret, by Gwendolyn Page, is a direct reference to the fact that the Wrens in the WWII service thought that their secret about Bletchley Park had been broken by the men. And that's where I decided to write this book about the Wrens and the WWII service, because I thought, here it is, history has been written by grey-haired old men. It overlooks the role women have played in the war, and it overlooks, in the case of this group of women, it overlooks the important, actual, vital role they played in operations. Thank you very much.